I would like to introduce Betsy McCaughey. Is a patient advocate, constitutional scholar, and former Lieutenant Governor of New York State. In 1993, she read the full 1,300 plus pages of Clinton Health, warned the nation and made history. Today she is doing it again. The latest book about Obama health law released last week, of which there is information currently available in electronic form, Decoding the Obama health law, what you need to know. The woman that started it all by reading the bills, and probably one of the few people, including our illustrious Elliot Engels, who last year, 2 years ago, claimed he wrote it. Okay? Dr. Betsy McCaughey.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be with you. We are the Americans who are going to protect our liberty. I want to pay tribute to you, not only for being here today, but I know that you've been very active. And active in supporting veterans, active in standing up for our rights, supporting the Tea Party principles. And I just want to say thank you on behalf of all the Americans who are sitting home being couch potatoes, not so aware of how in danger their liberties are, our liberties. But the fact is, right now, our freedom, our way of life, our values are under attack. And this is one of the primary mechanisms. This Obama health law, it shreds our constitutional rights. It forces you to enroll in a one-size-fits-all, government-designed health plan, whether you want it or not, whether you can afford it or not. And, as Barry just pointed out, it empowers the IRS to track you down and penalize you if you fail to comply. Nothing in the United States Constitution permits this. In fact, those 28 beautiful words of the 10th Amendment expressly prohibit it. But even worse, for the first time in history, this law empowers the federal government to dictate how doctors treat privately insured patients. So say you're in a plan, an Aetna plan or a Cigna plan, that you paid for yourself. The government is still going to be in charge of your doctor. Section 1311 of this law says that those government-approved health plans you have to be in can pay only doctors and hospitals that obey whatever the federal government dictates in the name of quality. Well, that broad, unlimited definition, it includes everything. When your cardiologist recommends a stent versus a bypass, or it could include when your OBGYN decides to do a cesarean. Your treatments will be entered into an electronic medical record. Your doctor's decisions will be monitored for compliance with federal guidelines, a real standardization of medicine. And ultimately, your doctor might have to choose between doing what's right for you and avoiding a government penalty. So we'll talk a lot more about what that could actually mean for you in a minute. The president promised that he was going to help solve the problem of the uninsured by making health plans more affordable. But obviously that's not what he's done. I'm sure you've gotten your premium hikes in the mail, right? Instead, what this law does is to vastly expand Medicaid. It literally will mean that almost a third of Americans will be on Medicaid. That's where almost all the currently uninsured and many other people will be going, onto Medicaid, turning us really into a Medicaid nation. And how will this vast expansion of Medicaid be paid for? Well, there are $503 billion in new taxes and fees in this law. And already in Washington, they're floating the idea for an additional tax, a VAT, a Vanishing America tax. Do not let them call it something else. That's what it is, a Vanishing America tax. It will push the price of goods way beyond what any of us can reach. But in addition to all the taxes, this law pays for the vast expansion of Medicaid by eviscerating, destroying Medicare. It takes $575 billion out of Medicare just in the first decade. and moves it over to fund that new entitlement, that big expansion of Medicaid and those subsidies, right? $575 billion out of Medicaid over this first decade, just when 30% more people are going to be enrolled in Medicare as the baby boomers turn 65. I'm one of those babes turning 65. What is it going to mean? It's going to mean fewer hip replacements, fewer knee replacements, fewer angioplasties, fewer bypass surgeries, fewer cataract operations. Those are the 5 procedures that have virtually transformed the experience of aging in this country. There was a time, I remember, when older people were so crippled with arthritis, they were stuck in wheelchairs, so out of breath from clogged arteries that they were stuck in nursing homes, unable to get around. Now older people enjoy their later years, right? With their grandchildren or traveling, or doing all kinds of things, shopping. This law will undo that progress. Richard Foster, the chief actuary of Medicare, he works for the president, told Congress on April 22nd, 2010, that the cuts in Medicare are so severe that 15% of hospitals will be forced to operate in the red. They won't be able to make any money anymore. They won't even be able to break even because they're going to cut what hospitals pay to take care of the elderly. And he said the rest of the hospitals are going to be forced to operate in an environment of what I would call government-imposed scarcity. Fewer nurses on the floor, less money to clean the hospitals, less diagnostic equipment and longer waits for those diagnostic tests. And he warned Congress, some hospitals will literally stop taking Medicare. Where will seniors go when the local hospital stops taking Medicare?
The grave.
Where?
This way. The grave. Or have to run the Medicaid system.
Have to go into, right, right.
Wait a
Now,
long line.
to halt this attack on our liberty and on our health care, 28 states are now challenging the constitutionality of this law. 28 states! That's right. Is this law unconstitutional? She said, are you serious? Well, we Americans have gotten serious about our Constitution. 28 states, and we are now in the Supreme Court of the United States with a decision due in late June. And I'm hopeful that with the U.S. Constitution on our side, freedom will prevail.
But Obama is pushing this through right now.
That's right. He's pushing through early preparations for this law as fast as possible. This president, who has no respect for the United States Constitution, who literally handed out waivers, 1,472 waivers, allowing certain companies and certain unions the freedom not to obey the law the rest of us have to obey. He doesn't understand that in these United States, the rule of law is king, not Mr. Obama. Right, right? Right. I am hopeful that with the U.S. Constitution on our side, freedom will prevail and the United States Supreme Court will make the right decision. But if not, we Americans have another opportunity to overturn this law in November when we go to the ballot box, right, and turn out those who have supported it. So we can prevail in this. And the stakes are very, very high. My view is that Congress should have taken this 2,572-page law before they enacted it, when it was just a proposed bill, and they should have crammed it in a paper shredder and given us a 20-page bill in plain, honest English that members of Congress would actually read before they vote on it. 20 pages. It ought to be enough. The framers of the Constitution created the entire federal government in just 18 pages, right? They knew how to put pen to paper. Yes, there it is. The greatest document ever created by the hand of man, the United States Constitution. The stakes are very high because in if you're seriously ill, the best place to be is in the United States. A woman diagnosed with breast cancer in the United States has over a 90% chance of surviving it. In Europe, her chances are less than 80%. If you do the arithmetic, that means she's twice as likely to die from it. A man diagnosed with prostate cancer in the United States has a 99% chance of surviving it. It is not a death sentence here. But nearly 1 out of every 4 men diagnosed with prostate cancer in Europe dies from it. And if someone in your family has what's currently considered an incurable illness, this is the nation of hope. This is where the cures are developed. Since 1950, the United States has won more Nobel Prizes in medicine and physiology than the entire rest of the world combined. And that's why this is the fight of our lifetimes. Let's get together and make sure we win it.
Yes.
I'd love to open this up for comments and questions. We have a lot to talk about, but I'd like you to set the agenda. Yes, ma'am.
Betsy, I heard you on the radio, and you had mentioned, I'm not sure which radio station, that you thought it was going to be overturned, but you were concerned that the mandate wouldn't be overturned?
Well, what I said was, and of course, for those in the room who are in the investment business, you're used to making bets. That's not my field. But I'll tell you what I think may happen. Right? I'm hoping that we win 6-3.
Yeah.
The ladies against the Jets.
Yes.
When you listened to the Supreme Court oral arguments, it was stunning to me that not one of the women justices ever raised the issue of liberty.
Yeah.
Never once did one of those women judges ask anything about how important it would be or how the individual's liberty could be protected. It was not on their agenda at all.
Well, you would think Breyer would go with Burke.
I think that there's a chance that Breyer may go.
Really?
Yes, I do. Just based on the oral arguments, and they can be misleading. But there's a chance for 6-3. In addition, the vast expansion of Medicaid is being challenged. And that may be our sleeper issue, because in every lower court, the challenges to the Medicaid expansion were defeated. And yet, the Supremes decided to hear that challenge anyway, an indication to me that they thought that was a serious threat to federalism. So we may win on that grounds as well. And we'll see what happens. Yes, sir.
What's the ramifications of Andrew Cuomo pushing through the exchange?
Well, it's a cavalier lack of respect for our hard-earned money. Because obviously, if the court strikes down much of this law, or even just the individual mandate and some of the accompanying regulations of insurance, those exchanges will not operate. And yet he is insisting on spending our hard-earned taxpayer money, setting up something that may never come to pass. Why doesn't he show a little restraint instead of playing politics and say, let's just hold back till June?
Right, but isn't he doing what Obama's doing?
Right, exactly. He's doing what Obama's doing. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to say the same thing. I mean, Obama's doing the same thing with the IRS, isn't he?
That's right. But you'd think we could ask more from our government. Well, and you know, everybody spends somebody else's money more liberally than they spend their own. Yes, sir.
What's the purpose of the president putting his hand on the Bible and swearing to protect and defend the Constitution?
Well, in this case, clearly it was a moot point.
Yeah.
He didn't do it.
He didn't do it. And unfortunately, many members of Congress don't do it either. They don't even think before they vote on a bill whether this conforms with the Constitution. And this Congress was warned because the Congressional Budget Office reminded them that the individual mandate was an unprecedented exertion of federal authority. Never before had this been tried. And not only that, but the Congressional Budget Office also reminded Congress way back in 1994, and unfortunately some of the same people are still sitting there. Yes, sir.
question is about the courts, you know, the power of the courts. I have to say, I'm not a conservative, but I'm someone who listens more on the, the so-called left talk shows like 1600 AM on New York, Tom Hartman and WBAI. I mean, those are shows I'm pretty sure most of you don't really like, the opinions. But Tom Hartman, he brought up an interesting point. The courts should not be making and striking down laws. It should be we, the people, through our representatives and a governor or president.
Let me address this question because I've been thinking about it for 45 years.
In the 1970s, we had the Warren
It is such an important question.
the liberal court, annoying
I got your gist. I got your gist. Now let me address this because it is the fundamental question. And to some extent, because of the response of the president and the mainstream media, the Supreme Court is on trial this spring. And it's not the first time. But the court's obligation is not to prefer its opinion to the opinion of the public. Not to impose its values in place of the values of the public. The court's job is just this: to look at the bill, now a law, to compare it to that written constitution, and to elevate the people's fundamental law, that 18-page constitution, above the will of the Congress. It's not that the judicial branch of government is superior to the Congress. It's that the court's job is to make sure the people's higher law, fundamental law, as expressed in this Constitution, limits and defines the powers of every branch of government. Now, as I said, there was a time before when the court was also on trial. The framers of the Constitution talked about judicial review at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, those 55 men who got together behind closed doors and wrote the Constitution. They anticipated that there would be judicial review. And they talked about the obligation of the judiciary to limit what Congress did to make sure it always conformed with those enumerated powers under Article I. And in the early 1790s, the first federal judges actually toyed with the idea, well, maybe they should also strike down laws that violated their personal views on what was right or conform to natural law, what people talked about a lot in the 18th century. And no, they decided, for example, in Calder v. Bull in 1798, no, our power is only to measure the acts of Congress against this one standard, the written Constitution. Then, in 1798, the nation seemed to break apart into two parties for the first time ever: Federalists, including Adams and Washington, and these upstarts called Republicans, including Thomas Jefferson, who was elected president in 1800. So, after Jefferson won that election, John Adams made a series of midnight judicial appointments to fill the judiciary with Federalist-leaning judges before the new president came into office.
Marbury versus Mill.
And I get chills thinking about this. It was such an important time. And when Thomas Jefferson took office, he didn't want to recognize all those appointments. And a challenge was brought all the way up to the United States Supreme Court for John Marshall, Chief Justice, and the rest of the court to decide. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that that was the first time the Supreme Court was, quote, on trial in the court of public opinion. And here's what Marshall did. He's often credited with inventing judicial review. But in fact, it was an invention of the framers in 1787. Instead, he recognized that the authority, the legitimacy of the court was on trial because so many people feared that it was suspect, right? So he redefined judicial review, reminding the public that those judges do not have unlimited discretion, as you and Tom Hartman suggested. No, no. They can't measure an act of Congress against their own personal viewpoints. They are not the masters. The people who have expressed their will in the Constitution are the masters. And that's what this Supreme Court will be doing again. Just as John Marshall defined judicial review very carefully, he said, this new nation has a Constitution that defines and limits the powers of government. And so that there will be no mistakes or doubts about what those limits are, that Constitution is written. And then he said rhetorically, why would the framers have written down these principles, except that they have to be enforced as a practical limit on what Congress can do? So, to answer your question, the court's role is not to be superior to the public, but rather to enforce those limits that the public intends to impose on Congress. And if the public really wants an individual mandate, if they really want Congress to have unlimited authority to compel us to do whatever they want, buy whatever they want, enroll in whatever they want, well, let the people go amend the Constitution and broaden the powers of Congress. But that's not what this Constitution currently says. If you can find in Article 1 any place that says Congress can compel Americans to buy a product, step up to the plate and show us where it is.
Was the opposite?
Right. Right. So, that's the role of the court. Yes, sir.
What's the big difference between Romneycare and Obamacare?
Well, the reason that Romneycare is considered constitutional is that it was done by a state government instead of the federal government. And states have much broader legislative powers. So when Romneycare was challenged in the courts of Massachusetts, it passed constitutional muster because the Massachusetts state legislature has very broad what they call police powers, powers to regulate every aspect of our lives, right? It's unfortunate, but that's true. So it was deemed constitutional. I would support Romneycare, but it was deemed constitutional, whereas this clearly is not. Yes,
I have a
ma'am.
question. So, if 28 states are now opposed to the health care bill,
Yes.
can those individual states say, we're not doing it?
No, that's the unfortunate thing. And one of the reasons we will probably, I'm just predicting, win in the United States Supreme Court is that this law is such an assault on federalism. One of the tenets of our system of government is that states are sovereign, right, in their sphere of authority.